On the blurb of the 50th anniversary edition of Frank Herbert's classic science fiction novel Dune, the edition I have, it reads, "Before The Matrix, before Star Wars, before Ender's Game and Neuromancer, there was Dune, the greatest science fiction novel ever written." First published as a collected volume in 1965 after having been released in multiple instalments in a monthly analogue magazine, Dune would go on to be one of the most influential science fiction SF novels of all time. It would inspire many other SF universes such as the aforementioned Star Wars and the currently popular Warhammer 40,000 universe, just to name a couple. A product entirely of its time, Dune would become the archetypal example of new wave science fiction. Elements of hard science fiction can be seen in the elements of the story that deal with the environment, inspired by Herbert's study of the use of grasses to stabilise the Oregon sand dunes, a term that would become known as terraforming within the wider sphere of science fiction. However, Dune also explored darker concepts, with hints towards humanity's willing distrust of technology, and a particular stigma existing around the use of atomic weaponry. As mentioned, Dune is typical of new wave sci-fi. This movement introduced a more narrative-driven element to its literature, contained elements of the fantasy genre within it, whilst also breaking away from the, quote, many sacred cows in science fiction, its optimism, its preoccupation with technology, by calling for the exploration of inner space, end quote. One of the major ways that it did this was by exploring the universe's troubled relationship with technology, and especially atomics. Such a fascination with monumentally powerful weapons of mass destruction are also seen in many of the Dune-inspired universes, such as with Star Wars' planet-killing Death Star, or Warhammer 40,000's dramatically entitled Exterminatus. However, if Dune came before it inspired Star Wars, Star Trek, and so many others that we're familiar with, what was it that in turn came before and inspired Dune, and by extension, the New Wave movement as a whole? This video essay will therefore aim to explore this historical context, taking one specific view in order to answer one degree of this question. That aspect shall be that of nuclear technology, and how it was highly influential in incurring a substantial change upon American and English science fiction in the period between 1945 to 1965. In order to do so, this essay shall be divided into two distinct chapters. The first chapter will explore the end of the so-called Golden Age of SF, and the role of nuclear technology in ending it. This chapter shall briefly look at when this period was, why calling it a golden age is somewhat debatable, as well as the characteristics that defined SF of this period. Then, this chapter shall discuss how nuclear technology created an atmosphere within late 1940s society within which SF began to change after the, as Roger Luckhurst puts it, technocultural conjuncture of 1945. This chapter will then conclude with a case study, analysing Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, a novel which is an excellent example of a piece of fiction that exemplifies and illustrates the changing nature of SF during this time due to nuclear technology that led to the end of the Golden Age. The second chapter shall explore how the same themes in SF that brought about the end of the Golden Age continue to develop into what would become known as the New Wave movement, which began in the early 1960s, in which Dune would become a foundational component. This essay will not examine the New Wave movement itself beyond simply what is meant by the term. Instead, it will look at the 1950s and the nuclear events and technologies from that transitional decade, and how they were vital in shaping the tone and nature of science fiction into the New Wave. Specifically, there shall be three events examined here: the Soviet acquisition of the nuclear bomb, the development of the hydrogen bomb, which will include a case study of Alfred Bester's The Star's My Destination to demonstrate how vital this event was, as well as a brief note upon the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. This chapter will then close with a look at Walter M. Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz. Spoilers for all these novels are, of course, aired. As a final note, it is important to state that this is an examination of Western, specifically English and American, science fiction literature during this time. In part, this is due to keep this essay simple, as the crossover between spheres of language and media probably would each deserve a dedicated examination of their own, but also due to the limitations of my own experience with other forms of media, and my inability to read other languages. Chapter 1. The Death of the Golden Age. The so-called Golden Age of science fiction is generally accepted to have begun in either 1938 or 1939, when the massively popular science fiction magazine Astounding Science Fiction came under the editorial hand of one John W. Campbell. 1946 is the year that older historiography tends to recognise when this period ended, though more recent scholars suggest that the correct year to cite when discussing the death of the Golden Age would instead be 1950. One of the main issues regarding this discrepancy is as to what exactly is meant by the vague term Golden Age. Novelist and editor Robert Silverberg, for example, argued that the 1950s should instead be seen as when SF's true golden age began, as this is when the market for SF increased dramatically, seeing sales jump and the genre as a whole reach a wider audience. Personally, my views would be that the period of New Wave could be considered a golden age, as this is when the literary quality of SF saw a huge jump. However, if we really want to say that there is a golden age, then perhaps that would be right now, in our contemporary time, as impressive pieces of fiction continue to be published and astound and reach an ever wider audience. As ever, then, subjectivity is cause for debate. Perhaps defining when science fiction truly experienced a golden age should be for a later discussion. It might therefore be pertinent to describe the period that is traditionally seen as the golden age as a Campbellian period instead, in honour of the man who held so much sway over the genre during this time. Using this logic, we might suggest that the Campbellian period ended in 1950 and experienced its own golden age between the years of 1938-9 to 1945. However, that is also the source of another debate. So, for the ease of understanding and to reduce complexity, this essay shall continue to use the phrase golden age to describe the period of 1946 to 1950, which saw SF works change slightly but still retain their signature identity due to astounding science fiction, which is henceforth abbreviated to ASF, and Campbell's dominance of the genre. Fiction from this period, especially that from ASF, typically had more of an emphasis upon hard science fiction, in no small part due to Campbell's guidance, as well as containing themes of optimism and progressive advancement. However, Campbell's personal interest in technology led to the themes of technological optimism and progressive advancement brought about by the use of technology. The period of the Golden Age itself falls outside of this essay's purview, but the details of its end are vital. Competition to ASF had steadily increased and gained traction. Other SF magazines had caught up and begun to publish literature that had reached the literary quality and maturity of ASF, and often exceeding it. The prime example was Galaxy, which launched in 1950 and was edited by Horace L. Gold. Galaxy had the goal of publishing well-written, sophisticated SF, a cut above the level of the ideas-oriented stories in Astounding. Additionally, the rise of the softback novel was another contributor to the downfall of Campbell's monopoly on SF. Cheap and accessible, long-form prose gave authors a greater chance to explore the concepts that they wrote about through greater word counts and less editorial influence, so that they could add more depth and nuance to their stories. Though it would not be until the late 50s and 60s that paperback novels truly took off, they were becoming a contributing factor to the downfall of SF magazines, and thus the so-called Golden Age. However, softback novels and alternative magazines like Galaxy were simply vessels for the wider change occurring in late 1940s SF, of which the influence of real-life nuclear technology was a key element. As previously mentioned, SF from this period had begun to shift towards exploring less optimistic themes. This can be attributed to changing social attitudes in the Western world, in large part due to the Cold War. As relations between the USA and USSR deteriorated, nuclear technology established itself as the primary cause for these poor relations. Concern amongst the wider population for the devastation that could be brought about by the use of these weapons was reflected in the SF stories of this period. Since 1939, Campbell had featured an item within ASF that had reported upon advances made in atomic science, optimistic that it would be the next technological step in bringing humanity towards the futuristic utopia which was so often depicted within the SF in the magazine. Campbell would even feed his authors information about nuclear research that he had obtained from connections that he had within research facilities, earning him an investigation towards the end of the war by American counterintelligence services. We was let off with just a warning. Post-Hiroshima and Nagasaki, however, SF as a whole experienced a tonal shift, generally being less optimistic as the true horror of atomic weaponry was revealed to the world. We can see from the stories that were published in this period that authors knew that the world had crossed a line with atomic technology by using it first for destruction rather than for good. More hopeful SF from before 1945 had imagined nuclear technology be used for fuel and power, for example. Key to understanding this shift, we must consider that SF authors, though often naturally well educated in matters scientific and technological, were still members of society. Thus, they were exposed to and shared in the moods and shifts of opinion that occurred within the wider public body. Therefore, the tone and content of the stories can be seen as a kind of reflection of society's thoughts, or, at the very least, a portion of it. It is not surprising, then, to discover that the early Cold War, with all of its fear, uncertainty and weariness from World War II, saw a surge in pessimistic, fearful and sceptical SF that had a tendency to warn about the dangers of using such devastating technology, especially following the Soviets' acquisition of nukes and their successful testing of the technology in 1949. It now seems certain that, quote, the bombs will never again, as in Japan, come in ones or twos. They will come in hundreds, or even thousands. A good case study to examine that effectively illustrates how SF became rooted in the early Cold War's nuclear socio-technological skepticism would be Ray Bradbury's 1950 novel The Martian Chronicles. It is an interesting example for a number of reasons. It is a fix-up novel, put together from multiple short stories published in a variety of magazines, none of which were ASF, and patched together with news stories to create a softback novel. Additionally, throughout the novel, the path that humanity was taking during the 1950s was pessimistically questioned, judging the self-righteous nature of human mentality as the characters come across the devastated remains of a once mighty Martian civilization. It's important to highlight all of these details as they form a kind of compilation of all that is the antithesis of Golden Age fiction, a softcover novel not published in ASF and pessimistic about technology, and specifically nuclear technology. The primary element in this novel that causes it to diverge from the norms of Golden Age fiction is its aforementioned pessimism surrounding technology. The novel includes examples of Cold War tech, such as space rockets, described as somewhere in between a World War II V2 rocket and the early designs used in space exploration. But it is Spender's monologue that allows for the greatest insight. Spender is an early space explorer who goes rogue, and during a conversation in the novel that spans 2 pages, he references nuclear war and atomic bombs multiple times. He argues that once humans colonise Mars, there will be power struggles and it will be inevitable that what remains of the Martian culture will be destroyed by humans. He even goes as far as to kill some of his fellow explorers in order to preserve the remains of the Martian civilization. The entire extract, which is easily one of the most memorable parts of the novel, is a conversation in morality, one in which Spender makes some excellent points regarding the casual and careless destruction that humanity often brings about to its surroundings. It is an incredibly poignant moment within the novel, and the reader is encouraged to agree with him, despite him being a killer and working against what is best for human advancement. Such an argument would have held a special kind of weight within the context of the tensions of the early Cold War, and indeed, it is still relevant with the tensions we find ourselves confronted with within our own time period. The ending of the novel is poignant too. Here, Mars is almost entirely abandoned by the human colonisers when the news about war erupting on Earth breaks, with people heading back to the home world to fight. We hear reports of multiple locations being struck by nuclear devices, and the handful of people remaining on Mars are some of the only survivors of the human race. One such group is a refugee family from Earth, and in the final chapter the father tells his sons he will show them the Martians. He takes his family to a canal and has them look at their reflections in the water, for now they are the Martians. He knows that his friend's family are on the way with their daughters, and it will be down to the children to ensure the continuation of the species, remarking upon the problems that will arise from there being 3 sons and only 2 daughters. Both this final scene and Spender's monologue help to illustrate how truly pervasive nuclear themes were in society, and SF by extension. With a novel published right at the end of what many consider to be the end of the Golden Age, it allows us to see the clear transition from positivity and optimism to entirely the opposite. The stark and depressing future that Bradbury tells of is entirely the product of human ambition, arrogance, and the indiscriminate use of nuclear weaponry. Exactly the path that the early Cold War society seemed to be headed in. The influence of nuclear technology in this novel is therefore obvious to see. By 1950, works like Bradbury's were becoming the norm as humanity's relationship with technology was reassessed. We can see, then, how technology was a huge influence upon society, and by extension, science fiction, during this period. It brought about a pessimistic, techno-skeptical breed of SF that, by its very nature, was almost a complete antithesis of the ideals of Campbell's Golden Age, and thusly, with the increasing prevalence of work of this nature, marked the end of this period in SF's history. Perhaps no self-respecting sci-fi author could look at such devastating new technologies and see an entirely peaceful path ahead. Or, at the very least, such peaceful stories have proven to be nowhere near as interesting and popular as those exploring the apocalypse, and did not sell as well. Regardless, the way was left open for something far grimmer and fatalistic to take the Golden Age's place. Chapter 2. The Birth of the New Wave. As explored in the last chapter, science fiction was shaped in part by the ongoing Cold War and the influence that nuclear technology had upon society. This led to the end of the Campbellian Golden Age as the nature, content and form of the publications shifted. By 1950, this period was most assuredly over, and as the Cold War began to escalate, so too did SF continue to evolve in its shadow throughout this decade. The result of this development would culminate in the 1960s with the New Wave movement. Beginning in the early 1960s, this movement would once again be a product of the time in which it occurred, moulded by the social environment within which its authors resided. This second chapter will therefore examine the transitional period of the 1950s that developed into new wave fiction, and explore the key role of technology, specifically nuclear technology, within its development. Before one can examine what created new wave fiction, however, one must understand what defined literature from the movement itself. SF from this period was possessed of, quote, often highly sophisticated literary skills, but sometimes marking the triumph of form over substance, fatalism over faith, and despair over destiny. The universe no longer blazed with potent opportunity, but, shrunken, crumbled into lassitude, colours fading, except perhaps for the vivid acid phantoms within one's own skull. Western culture, gripped by malaise, had left its golden age, and SF mirrored that condition. Though long and perhaps overly descriptive, this quote does nevertheless perfectly encapsulate the general trend that SF from this period followed. The continuation of increasing literary quality can be seen to be a carryover from Horace L. Gould's Galaxy and the aims of high literary quality and sophistication it aspired to. As the excerpt states, there is more of an emphasis upon form over substance. Where authors of the Campbellian Golden Age would often sacrifice literary quality and narrative in order to make technological, social and political points, SF of the New Wave was much more effective in weaving such agendas into the plot of the larger tale being told. Perhaps this is not a coincidence that this development coincided with the large-scale adoption of softback novels as a package for prose, within which the greater word counts allowed much higher levels of sophistication in such commentaries. The second element of this excerpt describes the malaise that gripped Western culture, from which SF also suffered. Again, this is a continuation from the social factors previously discussed which led to the end of the Golden Age. Though, as David Seed puts it, SF developed bleak humour and startling graphics to break up the solemnity with which had been expected from SF. This is perhaps a symptom of the society having existed in a dangerous and volatile world for some time, overcoming the shock and fear and coming to terms with its situation, turning current events into half satire and half prediction. There are three main nuclear events that contributed to the 1950s society's malaise. These were events that would shape and define the world within which they existed. The first of which, the Soviet Union's official acquisition of the nuclear bomb, took place not in the 50s, but a year earlier, in 1949. Regardless, it will be perhaps the most politically significant event in nuclear technology's history after the bombing of Japan, as it signified the beginning of the nuclear arms race. It will be a catalyst for both sides of the Iron Curtain to begin building up their nuclear stockpiles. The loss of America's monopoly upon this most destructive of technologies was picked up on by SF authors. Again, Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicle stands out as a good example, written 1 year after the Soviets' bomb acquisition as a purposefully elegiac tone, so showing what Earth could face if the technology of nuclear weaponry was to be used. This event established an atmosphere within Western society, which in turn naturally extended to influencing SF. As such, stories after the Soviets' acquisition of the nuclear bomb generally increased in their suspicion and disdain of the technology as the nuclear arms race began, and pushed the balance of global politics just that much closer to the precipice. In the early 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union would develop the thermonuclear bomb, more commonly known as a hydrogen bomb or an H-bomb, a weapon magnitudes more destructive than the fission bombs dropped on Japan, and by recreating the violent expenditure of energy that occurs millions of times a second in the centre of stars. This second nuclear event had an impact upon SF that was perhaps the most influential of the period in bringing about the New Wave movement. SF would therefore be used as one of the conduits to convey Western society's shock and dismay at such a dangerous new weapon and escalation, using its relatively influential position to ask questions such as what would be the next development in the technologies of destruction. With SF's tendency to warn, the literature would pick up on this. Alfred Best's The Star's My Destination is an excellent example to show the impact of the H-bomb upon science fiction. Published in 1956, which was a handful of years after the news that the USSA and USSR had both successfully tested hydrogen bombs. Besides some very accurate depictions of space travel that were absent from Bradbury's earlier book, Best's novel focuses upon Gully Foyle's revenge upon a ship that left him for dead in the void of space. He means to use pyre, a substance subsequently revealed to be a psychoactive superweapon that is crucial to winning an intersolar war. Throughout the entire novel, the reader is drip-fed information regarding the potency of pyre, until we are led to vaguely be able to understand that it can even put atomics to shame. Best's novel can be seen as a not-so-subtle commentary upon the lunacy and terror of the new weapons of the Cold War, particularly the H-bomb, as the novel was released in the wake of this weapon's development. The Star's My Destination's focus upon this mysterious WMD can be interpreted as SF once again displaying its predictive nature, speculating upon what's next. The sheer preposterousness of a telepathically activated bomb would perhaps have been seen just as preposterous as a bomb that uses the atomic reactions of suns for the means of destruction only a few years before. Additionally, at the end of the novel, Gullifoyle rapidly distributes pi around the globe, giving it to ordinary people and letting humanity as a whole, rather than its leaders and elites that he had spent the entire novel struggling against, choose its fate. Destroy themselves to no end, or follow him out into the stars to meet their destiny. Here, then, we can see the novel as a conduit for social commentary regarding dangerous new technological weapons. Bester makes the point that humanity is on a clear road to self-destructing, so intent as it is upon developing ever more destructive weapons with their technology, instead of using it for something peaceful that would benefit our species. In this case, space exploration. In Bester's novel, we see nuclear technology impacting SF, creating a bitter, cynical apprehension and distrust that would go on to be a core element of new wave science fiction. Finally, the third event of this transitionary period would take place in 1962 and become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the closest times humanity got to obliterating itself during the Cold War, and certainly the most public, it's quite clear how this event might contribute to building distrust and reducing faith in technology within society and SF writers that would lead to the New Wave movement. As Damien Broderick puts it, for so many people this event was a science-fictional threat. This essay shall not go into depth on this topic, but as such an important societal event that had been caused by nuclear technology, it was instrumental to feeding the New Wave movement that had, by now, seen novels written that would be seen as founding publications for this movement. As a final case study, Walter M. Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz serves as an excellent novel to examine. First published in 1959, the novel is widely considered to be one of the first examples of a new wave SF, and was influential to all of the authors who would write as a part of that movement. A story that takes place in 3 separate sections, each centuries distant from one another, it tells the tale of a lonely abbey of monks in a nuclear wasteland following an atomic war, whose job it is to preserve humanity's knowledge until the race is ready to use it again. The story progresses through this dark age, then to something akin to another renaissance in the second part, and the third and final time period wherein humanity has progressed further than before, and is now able to explore near space with relative ease. Nuclear war breaks out between the Atlantic Confederacy and the Asian Coalition, with the instigator unclear. In the final chapter, a small group of monks leave Earth in a spaceship with humanity's collective knowledge to once again shepherd it to safety as nuclear explosions tear open Earth's surface. Canticle for Leibowitz illustrates the early reaction within SF to the aforementioned increasing integration of technology within society, and takes a characteristically cynical new wave stance upon this. While Leibowitz was met with some negative reception by more mainstream reviewers, high praise was heaped upon Miller by other SF authors and publications, and he won the 1961 Hugo Award for Best Novel for his work. Published before the New Wave movement had gained any serious momentum, form or identity, the novel was ahead of its time in many respects. A Canticle for Leibowitz embodied what would come to be the defining characteristics of New Wave, a focus upon more sophisticated prose and pessimistic, often satirical views regarding technology. In Miller's story, technology, or more accurately the human mishandling of technology, fills the role of dictator and authoritarian government seen in previous fiction. As the novum, technology serves as an omnipresent threat over all 3 parts of the story. The fears displayed within the novel are reflective of the concerns of the Cold War regarding nuclear science, specifically the nature of how human mismanagement of the technology that had previously only existed within the pages of science fiction stories themselves might result in catastrophe. He manages this by using the novel as a vessel through which human mismanagement of technology is the focus of the story, rather than analysing the theoretical after-effects of such an event with copious amounts of scientific jargon as SF from previous time periods might have done. This focus upon the mismanagement also cements the dystopia depicted as a product of human failure rather than by malicious authoritarian politics. By using the inner space as a narrative technique, Miller's novel shows itself to be an early contributor to the wider counterculture movement of this time period. Authors such as Miller recognise that due to the larger role that technology was playing in society, any kind of future dystopia would owe its creation and sustenance to the use of technology in some form or another. In this sense, dystopian SF and New Wave SF as a whole was far more introspective in its outlook. The focus of these stories was not upon the technology itself, but rather the interaction between humans and the technology. Often this relationship ends poorly due to mismanagement, be that malicious or not, which leads to some form of dystopian future. This introspection led to a focus upon inner space in New Wave fiction, rather than the outer space of rockets, aliens and ray guns of Campbellian era stories. By 1965, the New Wave movement had undoubtedly become its own distinct subgenre of science fiction. The movement is mostly characterised by its desire to increase the literary quality of SF to break away from what's becoming an increasingly stagnant genre. Concluding thoughts. The tonal shift that occurred within it owes much to the cultural dissatisfaction with nuclear technology that permeated through society at this time. The influences that led to the end of the Campbellian Golden Age and the beginning of the New Wave movement were varied, and to fully examine each would surely need a full series of videos to completely explore them. However, as illustrated by this video essay, nuclear technology can be seen to be one of the primary influences as the impact of this technology bled into wider society and the culture and content of science fiction from this period. The initial shock of the weapons use at the end of World War II and the subsequent developments of the early Cold War period turned SF from a usually positive tone to one of technological suspicion and pessimism. Additionally, as the Cold War escalated, these negative feelings only grew to be expressed more often and with greater thoughtful depth in everyday society and science fiction. Thank you for watching this video. This is something different that we are trying for our channel, as we would like to broaden the kind of content that we create and to try and produce something of high quality. This video is also a necessarily brief look at the topic. It was not written to be a comprehensive analysis of this subject. An undertaking by that should be done by someone who has a much greater credentials than I, and quite frankly, someone who also has more of a will to do so. The script for this video was adapted from a second year university research project that I had to do, so perhaps whilst it wasn't as good as I would have liked it to have been, it was an interesting topic and I thought it deserved to be turned into a video. I hope that it's given those of you who watched this and those few still who made it this far some kind of insight into the topic, or at the very least you found it interesting in some kind of incredibly nerdy way. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.